would not be surprised at all that there are properties in this room right now that have historic racialized covenants attached to them. What's interesting, I don't even know if I would call it interesting, but what is not unexpected, if you look at the maps of racialized covenants and then you look at the most current census data about where wealth and higher income levels are centralized in the Twin Cities, it follows almost identical to those racialized covenants. What we see from this, and what stood out, there's a line that stood out to me that said these racialized covenants were not just about discriminating against black people, but it was inherently about empowering and enriching white people. We know, if we're honest with ourselves, we know that urban poverty, as it's centered in black and brown communities, is not an accident of happenstance. It is an intentional, deliberate creation. When you think about all the times 2 years ago the words race riots were attached to Minneapolis. And then come to find out that here in Minneapolis we have a history of race riots. It was just not the race rioting that one would expect, or that some branches of the news media would portray today. We think about the Lee family house down on 46 in Columbus. When you do a little bit more research, as many as 5,000 people showed up at that intersection to intimidate that one family. And they did it with such regularity that street vendors and ice cream men used to come through and sell their wares. And they could set their schedule because they know they would have a captive audience of up to 5,000 people. All to push one family, to intimidate one family out of a neighborhood. Now, here we are, gathered in a historic church in this city. What is the responsibility of the church? Well, I would ask you, if we're talking about Minneapolis in the late 20s and early 30s and a crowd of 5,000 people show up, I promise you at least 4,980 of them went to church every Sunday. This is not a problem that we as people of faith have the luxury of pointing our fingers out there without following the gospel to commit to repair the harm that our beloved institutions help perpetuate. Because somewhere in our collective history, as people of faith, somewhere 5,000 people of our brothers and sisters in the faith thought that it was an okay thing to go hang out and try and push a black family out on a Friday evening. Bring along 15 cents and buy yourself an ice cream bar because you know the good humor man's coming through. We need to do something about that. Our guest this evening is actively committed to doing something about that. I'm going to go completely off off script and off bio here. AsaleSol Young has an incredibly impressive bio, but I have had the pleasure of considering AsaleSol a good friend for, 4 or 5 years now. In that 4 to 5 years, I have known AsaleSol to be relentlessly dedicated to tearing down the system of white supremacy, particularly as it affects Black and brown people in the area of housing. She has a wide, incredible background in theater, in performance arts, in studying theater and justice around the world. AsaleSol is the current executive director of Urban Homeworks, and in that role has been tirelessly committed to ensuring that Black and brown people have access to affordable, sustainable, and dignified housing. And I'm going to stop talking and turn the microphone over. So would you please welcome AsaleSol Young.
Hello. All right. I have to take a breath after that. I have to ground in my body. And so as Jim Bear asked you all to do before he passed me the mic, I'm going to just ask us to do that together. So if you could just sit in your seats in a way that your feet are firmly planted on the ground. And I want you to close your eyes for just a brief moment and really allow yourself to get out of your mind. We have a habit of only feeling things with our intellect. So I'm just going to ask you to breathe in and feel your breath kind of move down from the top of your head to the soles of your feet. And as you exhale, consider how that made you feel, just to take in that history. And as this is a predominantly white audience, I'm going to ask you to consider how that history sits in the lives, the hearts, and bodies of your Black and brown family. Go ahead and take one last deep breath. Exhale. Thank you for doing that with me. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that we are gathered together on land that was stolen from the Dakota people, land that was also developed by West African people through the transatlantic slave trade. My name is AsaleSol Young, and I'm the executive director of Urban Homeworks. Urban Homeworks is a small, affordable housing organization. We've been around since 1998, and we began in the Phillips neighborhood with one duplex, and have grown into an institution that owns 136 units of affordable housing, affordable for anyone making between 20 to 50% of the area median income. And that's across North and South Minneapolis and St. Paul, Frogtown and St. Paul. We also develop homes for affordable sale for anyone making less than 80% of the area median income. And at the center of our work is community. We are driven by the lived realities of folks in the communities that we serve. And so everything that we do, the changes and transformations that the organization has undergone are in order to move us closer to being led by those who are historically oppressed by the system of housing. As an example, I am the first non-white, non-male, non-evangelical executive director of this 30-year organization. I love the laughter. Our vision, I think, is really what drives us. Again, it's the folks on the ground really leading what we do. And I'm just gonna, if you could go to the next slide. So you can see from these, like where we pretty much develop our housing, like I said, it's North and South Minneapolis. Our foundation is in Phillips. And majority of our housing goes to Black and brown folks. On the next slides, you'll see how the comparison of those redlining maps that you saw in the documentary, the areas that we focus on, Phillips, Central, North, look very similar to those 1935 maps. So as they pointed out in the documentary, not much has changed. Even after 1968, fair housing became considerably more fair. You can go ahead to the next slide. So what does this mean about today? So what I love about this documentary is it acknowledges the reality, the power of wealth building, that housing was afforded to specific people and denied to others. Something that I'd really love for folks to start to really think about is what was allowed in their families. What did that access to housing grant you in your family? You can go to the next slide. I think it's the next, after this one. We have an income gap in this country, a 60% income gap between Black families and white families. That's just income. When we get into accumulated wealth, Black families make up less than 20% of the wealth that white families have accumulated. Obviously, when we go back to the history, it's clear to understand why. You have, sorry, you can keep scrolling. I'm just talking. I can do better about slowing down. It's easy to see why. So you have, over time, white families participating in what was considered fair housing, and Black families being excluded from those practices, and being able to purchase homes with mortgages. So in 1934, the federal government established the mortgage, the 30-year mortgage. Jim Crow of the North really focuses on Minneapolis, but let's zoom out and look at the country, what was happening nationwide. And you've got families able to purchase homes that were no more than 2 to 3 times the income at that time. So they're buying homes at rates that are incredibly low, given what we see in housing today. And as we know, wealth accumulates over time. And Black families, Black and brown families, were excluded from that. In 1968, you can go to the next slide, when fair housing was established, you already have 30 years of wealth gap developed. You already have 30 years of white families being able to pass on home ownership to their grandchildren, to their children, leverage the equity in their housing for furthering their education, for taking care of elderly parents. or simply giving the equity to those that came next. So by the time the Fair Housing Act is erected, market rate homes are 6 to 8 times national income, so from 2 to 3 to 6 to 8. You already have a growing income gap between Black and white households. And now that Black families are permitted to have more freedom and protection in buying homes, the access to those homes financially is much more out of reach. And this is just something that I think is worth keeping in mind. The government sanctioned segregation, and it sanctioned the discrimination, housing discrimination. But this was unconstitutional. And I just think that's important to keep in mind. So you can go to the next slide. So it's just kind of walks us through what you saw in the video, just kind of slows us down a little bit. So before 1968, you have racial covenants, which really were erected as early as 1910. Restrictive deeds, redlining, threats and violence, which you saw in the film. After 1968, we have exclusionary zoning, predatory lenders, and loan rejections, gentrification through the building of highways, regulating Black and brown families to what we now call slums, oftentimes put in communities where there is high toxicity, so factories, pollution in the water and things like that, places that no one really wants to live. And I think the other thing that's really important to acknowledge is that renters are impacted by these practices as well. So while you have Black and brown families not able to purchase homes, you have realtors taking advantage of this discrimination, so charging high rates for white families to try to keep their neighborhoods white, using fear tactics to get white families to sell their homes at low rates. You also have predatory landlords who are knowing that Black families often don't have a choice in buying or where they live, creating substandard living conditions and offering them to folks at very high rates as well. So this is what we get at the end of that. We get the Twin Cities as having the greatest racial disparity in housing. We're usually in the top 2. It fluctuates. Minnesota as a state is typically in the top 5 for that discrimination. How does this look over time? So what's interesting about this is from 1990 to 2017, you see how white homeownership has had ebbs and flows. Largely, I would say, has been about the same. But distinctly, Black families have lost ownership from 1990 to 2017. This breaks out the data between white, Asian, Native, Hispanic, and Black families. And again, you see the decline over time. So people are often curious how this looks today. And what we know is that the government sanctioned this kind of racism, this kind of oppression. And so even though 1968 made it illegal to respond to people in this way based on race, we know that individual racism was still permitted. And so you have things like the assessments on homes at sale. So let's say you have a home that is 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms in a Black neighborhood. You take that same home in a predominantly white area, and its valued much less than that home in the white area. You have lending practices of mortgage originators that are assuming and acting on a practice of Black families not being able to make their mortgage payments, and so they are denying them access to mortgages and denying them access to refinance on their homes. Recently, Wells Fargo was in the news. I'm curious if anybody read about that. A couple folks, okay. So recently, Wells Fargo was in the news. Some of you may have noticed that Wells Fargo is got a big housing closing the gap initiative that they've got going on right now. But what led to that was them getting caught in racist lending practices and being forced by the court to put money into the communities that they were denying access to. Now, people will say, well, what about class? Because race and class are inextricably linked in this country. And of course they are. But what was really fascinating and undeniable about Wells Fargo was that white folks with lower incomes had a higher approval rate than black applicants with higher incomes. So it's clear that class was very little on their mind. The ability to repay that mortgage was not the impetus for denying people the mortgage. So, this stuff is very serious to me. It's like painful. It's like I can feel it in my body, and I think about my elders and my ancestors. But I wouldn't do this work if I didn't believe that we could do better. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? As I talked about in the film, number one, it means that we acknowledge this history. We all need to acknowledge this history. We all need to acknowledge that for some of us, we were permitted access to accumulating wealth over time across the generations, while others had their wealth extracted because of racist housing practices. And once we're able to acknowledge collectively this history, then it's really clear what it's going to take to change it. And I dared to use a word that I think makes some people very nervous. But harm was done. It was done systemically and systematically. And it is literally impossible to close the racial homeownership gap if we don't make significant investment into Black and brown home ownership. It is not enough to say that current government programs that hold white and non-white equal in their support is ever going to close that gap. We have to be willing to repair the very intentional harm of explicitly excluding Black and brown families. Second, housing as a commodity is something that we should all be questioning anyway. Housing is a human right. We saw how it became a commodity through the practice of redlining and prioritizing spaces and places where people can live. But at the end of the day, we all deserve to have shelter that is safe, that is with those that we love. We all deserve the opportunity to stably build community. And in acknowledgement of the wealth gaps and the income gaps that have been created, in part due to discriminatory housing practices, we have to start to reimagine what housing looks like. Shared ownership models are not in my mind, they're not the dream, they're not the end result, but they're a step along the way. We acknowledge that the land that we exist on is not for human ownership or consumption to begin with. We look to things like land trusts that keep homes affordable for the community because the land always belongs to the community and a new buyer is simply buying that brick and mortar household. Co-op models are something that Urban Homeworks, as an example, is pursuing. Co-op models are a form of shared equity similar to a condominium. Oftentimes, they're more accessible, though, to those making lower incomes. People will scoff at land trusts and co-op models and say that the equity that you can get out of those things is nowhere near the equity in the mainstream market. And that is true, but we also have to recognize that these are opportunities for people that do not have equity going into that purchase to begin with. And it's an opportunity, instead of paying rent to support your landlord, it's an opportunity to build a savings so that perhaps in the next iteration of ownership, you can buy a mainstream market home. Accessory dwelling units are something that a lot of folks in Minneapolis have been talking about as well. We have, if you don't live in South, because South is pretty congested, but a lot of times, there's a decent amount of land that comes with our single-family homes or large garages. And knowing that we have encampments all over the city, folks are asking the question, what can we do to provide a solution, to personally provide a solution instead of waiting for the government to do that? Zoning that allows accessory dwelling units is a possibility that allows an individual to say, I want to contribute to a solution with what I have. But we have to work on the zoning laws that will permit that. One of the easiest things that folks can do is to give. And I know that a lot of folks ask that of congregations, faith communities, ask that of white-bodied folks. But as I said, there is literally no way to close the home ownership gap if we do not intentionally begin to redistribute wealth, to give of the abundance that we have. So I encourage you to look to Black and Indigenous, specifically led organizations that are working on housing justice, that are being led by their communities. Don't stipulate how they use the money. Just give it. We only make change with resources. And that is what I have for you today. Any questions? Yes, in the back. Oh, sorry.
I'll bring the microphone. Well, we need it for the recording.
Can you speak to the lack of a Black middle class in these twin cities that relates directly to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, one of the things that the film didn't really address is that any time Black communities were able to persist through all of that violence and these made-up laws to say that we couldn't have anything, highways would be built. People would be offered to buy families out of their homes. People would try to create new laws to then push people out of those homes and break up those communities. And the lines on the redistricting maps would change. So when you'd have a burgeoning Black community that was creating wealth for itself, educating everyone in those communities, folks would come in and find ways to break that up. And we've seen it here in South Minneapolis. They talk about it in the video. We've also seen it in St. Paul. And then, of course, it was happening nationally as well. So oftentimes, stories of Black wealth exist as these anomalies. There was not an opportunity for collective resource building that remained safe in this country. I would say that the riots that they showed in the documentary were tame. People got hurt, and the police would often be there not to protect those families, but to make sure the white citizens did not get hurt.
I think people need to also understand that there's still policy out there that for discrimination, such as love letters, and I don't know if you all heard of that, which is a way of making sure your neighborhood stays white, and that is a potential buyer can write a letter to you and can describe themselves as white or whatever, and you will want to sell that home to them. So there's a lot of policies that are out there right now that people are just not aware of. How people get lending. I mean, most of the lenders are white, and when you think about economic and wealth creation, there needs to be some also push to get some more Black and brown lenders at the table.
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's a big issue.
Absolutely. And love letters, to your point, put the power really solely in the hands of the selling owner. There's not really any government intervention in that. And so those of you that might be considering selling your homes, think about your process, your practice. Any other questions? Yes.
How does Habitat for Humanity fall into this? Have they moved more of their house building towards immigrants and people that aren't Black and brown?
Not sure I fully understand your question. Habitat for Humanity, which is a national organization, has acknowledged that in terms of closing the Black and white homeownership gap, they actually have not had an impact on that. And I don't know if that was your question. Okay. And so I do go back to the slide that talked about investing in Black and Indigenous-led organizations. The solutions have to come from the people who are most harmed by these systemic practices. Any other questions?
I see all these apartment buildings being built that are expensive, and yet I know for sure that we have a huge problem with affordable housing in this community. And I know there are things that people are doing to try to change that, but what can be done about that? I mean, it's just huge.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. Developers are coming in, developing these high-end units. They're also coming in and buying up single-family homes in the neighborhoods that Urban Homeworks works in. North Minneapolis, parts of South, Frogtown, and St. Paul. And what they have the capacity to do that you all are aware of is just offer cash. And what that means is that their negotiation is far above anyone else's. You know, sometimes folks will take a lower offer because it is in cash. And so one of the things that is really helpful is to call your legislatures, to call your mayor, and talk about this as an issue. Pester them. The reality is that hearing from people like me, they're kind of like, yeah, we hear you, we know. But the more they hear from all of us, the more they have to listen. And so if this really does bother you, call them, because we need to create legislation that protects these properties from being purchased by for-profit corporations. Yeah.
That kind of ties into what I was going to ask. In the movie, and I wrote it down, they mentioned that all planning has always been intentional. So whether it's, and maybe it's the auxiliary dwelling units, talking to our council members about that, what are any specific policies that for around planning, whether at the state or local level, that would be good to bring up?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things I forgot to mention and that question reminded me of is that renters are impacted by all of this, right? If we don't have stabilized renters, they don't have the capacity to purchase homes. One legislation that we're pretty excited about is called the Bring It Home Minnesota legislation. Have folks in the room heard of that? One person? Oh, it was on the screen. Okay. Awesome. Glad I could expose you to it. But this is a statewide legislation to provide anyone making less than 50% of the area median income with a subsidy, meaning that they have choice in where they live, but they will never be required to pay more than 30% of their income toward their housing. And if you're paying 30% or more, you're considered cost burdened because so little is left over for you to pay for anything else. We are a part of like I said, a statewide coalition working to advance this legislation. And so to your question, sir, in the North Face, if folks can call their legislators and just even name Bring It Home Minnesota as something of value to you, that would be great. We all witnessed how our electeds chose not to put our surplus into action on the ground. And housing was a big thing that missed out on that in that decision. And then, like I said earlier, a lot of our zoning practices are citywide, like they're local. So that's not necessarily a conversation with your state legislator. It's a conversation with city council. It's a conversation with your mayor. Now we're a strong mayor system. So I say call Mayor Fry and talk about zoning that allows accessory dwelling units, talk about zoning that allows more affordable housing and affordable housing tax credits, which can be talked about with both on the citywide level and the state level. Any other questions?
So we know that these practices were not unique to the Twin Cities, were not unique to Minnesota. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any sociological research why Minnesota continually ranks as the worst in terms of housing disparity and wealth disparity nationally? Or even if you're not aware, do you have any personal opinions? Because here in Minnesota, we like to sell ourselves as free of institutional racism. You know, we were the good, innocent North people. And Minneapolis is filled with a lot of good, liberal, progressive white people. And so, given that, do you have opinions as to why we continue to rank in the worst year after year in these studies?
One of the things I love about the history of certain histories in the Twin Cities are that when we want something done here, we get it done. And to that question, there is a comfort with the status quo that goes back to what I said earlier about we have to acknowledge how we got here as the first step to getting out of this. People were able to build wealth because of the oppression of their Black and brown neighbors. When the stadium, the football stadium was erected, that was that was on the ballot. If all that money that went into that stadium went into housing, do you all think we would still have tent encampments? And that's a real question for you to take home. When we want things done here, we rally together and we get them done. So what would it look like to put that energy towards housing equity and justice? We can talk about it all day, to your point, Jim Bear. We do like to talk here. What happens if we go get something done? Put our money where our mouths are. Any other questions? Thank you all so much for the invitation to be with you. Oh.
Can you help us in that the legislature didn't pass the housing, even though there was real energy toward it?
Yeah.
And there are organizations who worked really hard at the Capitol. So we have an election coming up. Are there particular questions we should be asking of our candidates, or particular pieces of legislation that we should be pushing forward? I think oftentimes it's, and as you just said, if we all worked for fair housing, like the effort that was put forth to build the stadium, that would be great. But housing is such a huge thing with so many arms and legs that it's really hard for us to, a person like me, to grab onto a piece of it and try to do something. So it's the giving us the opportunity to step into an opportunity, I guess. And I don't mean to put the burden on you, because the burden should also be on me. But I think, getting back to my original question, between now and the election, like, what do you recommend that we do to put the pressure on our city council people and on our state legislators, all who are running for re-election?
Yes,
and our governor, and in this city, the whole 9 yards.
Yes, and I smile because it's a perfect question. So thank you for that question. Asking folks directly where they stand on affordable housing is a great question. Making it clear that for you, your priorities, who you're voting for, are candidates who believe in things like Bring It Home Minnesota, will fight for those things, candidates who recognize what I talked about earlier with developers coming into our communities and deepening, widening these gaps in affordability for our families. Pushing on the governor is going to be really important. He is faced with a Senate majority that does not agree with him. And so he's kind of torn between a rock and a hard place, but we're the voters, right? So we can, push hard enough to say we won't reelect you if you don't stand for housing. And then, the burden is still on you, because it's not just those phone calls. It's making sure that those that get the resources are from these disenfranchised communities. And that is something you can do whether there's an election or not. It's something you can do the day of, the day after, the day before. But how do you help funnel resources into community-led organizations that are working to solve this problem?
Thank you. It was what you were saying with the governor and being in a rock and a hard place, and I don't know, but I'm hoping you have good news, or at least some suggestions. The surplus in the state, were there any particular line items that would, now funds are going towards helping affordable housing?
Yeah, so there specifically, we came together statewide and asked for $20 billion to support homelessness, folks coming out of homelessness transition, affordable rental, and ownership opportunities. $2 billion is a drop in the bucket. It doesn't even come close, but it's also recognizing that, again, housing has not been prioritized by the Senate, and so really trying to just ask for the smallest amount to get a yes. And we're still, fighting. And so I think that, to that point, asking folks how they want to spend that money and if they will put it towards housing. Housing is complex. There's a lot of reasons for housing inequity, but the foundation of that we just all collectively learned about. And so the pieces of a human's decisions in one moment or the next, of course, can play a role, but a lot of people, I'm not even 40 yet. My generation is well educated, and a lot of us don't believe in home ownership because we didn't see our elders and our ancestors live into that. So for us, it's not something that we consider accessible or something that is considered a legitimate wealth building tool. Even though the data shows us otherwise, lived experience says, well, we don't have access to it, so we cannot depend on it. Housing is currently a commodity. As such, it is a wealth building tool. How do we give more Black and brown generations access to that tool? One of the things that Urban Homeworks is investing in is something we're calling a repair fund. And it's intentionally not called a reparations fund because that would be handing people houses, and we unfortunately cannot afford to do that ourselves. But the repair fund is built for for folks who haven't had the generational transfer to have that down payment. A lot of times, families, young people can go buy houses because their parents were able to support them with that down payment. People my age with similar education access do not have that if they are Black or brown. And so that's an opportunity for us to, in a small way, just begin to be an example of what change looks like. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all so much.
Well, thank you so much, AsaleSol. Thank you all for this really deep and hopefully motivating conversation, motivating us to imagine, not just imagine a better future, but to collectively create a better future. So this is the second part of our three-part series in which we are discussing and having conversations about historical and contemporary racism, and particularly how it sits within Black and Indigenous communities. I would like to take this opportunity to invite you all to our third and final conversation on July 11th, same time, same place here. We will be watching together, we will be watching the film White Savior. I'm in it, so I'm, kind of a big deal. I don't want to. We will be talking, we'll be bringing this conversation as people of faith, and I say that, I'm not assuming that everyone in the room is a person of faith, but we are in a building of faith. But we will be having a really targeted and deep conversation about best efforts of churches and their depiction of who Jesus is and their depiction of who they are. If you are a person of color and a person of faith, chances are you are familiar with this notion of white saviorism. You're probably, I know if you're like me, you're all too familiar with white saviorism. And this will be a conversation. We will watch this film together, and then we will have a small panel with Reverend Joanne Conroy, who is a Lakota woman. She's a pastor in the ELCA church. If you remember our guest from last month, this is Kelly's mom, Pastor Joanne Conroy. And then we will also be joined by Reverend Angela Khabib, who is not just a black woman, but a pretty incredible black woman pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in South Minneapolis. I have known her for a number of years, walked alongside her at protests, at rallies, at community grievings in states of in times of communal emergency. And Reverend Angela Khabib has just always been an incredible, wonderful ministering presence. But I can promise you, she's got some stuff to say about what it is to be a black woman in the whitest denomination in the country, in a church that is overwhelmingly white. Her local congregation in South Minneapolis is quite predominantly white. And she has some stuff to say as a black woman. And so we will be having that conversation about how white saviorism, how it is to come up in a faith that at times does not allow the full embodiment of who you are in the free expression of your Jesus, who you understand Jesus to be. So, July 11th, right here, from 6 to 8 p.m., and we will look forward to seeing you then.